Okay, from Navin. You have the song ready, Navin? Hold on.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste, assalamu alaikum. Good evening, good night, or good morning to all of you. We are so pleased to have people at this meeting from all parts of the world in different time zones. I am Shakira Mohammed of Trinidad and Tobago, a teacher for the past 17 years, and we want to wish Happy Father's Day to all our fathers, uncles, big brothers, stepdads, granddads, and mothers who fulfill the role of a father. So I'd like to ask Navin to play a song to celebrate Father's Day, and this is from the movie entitled Boss, with acting by Akshay Kumar, Mithun Chakrabarti, and Shiv Pandit. So the song was rendered by Sonu Nigam. Navin, please play the song.
Dr. Mary, after enable sharing.
Can you say that again?
Dr. Mary, after enable sharing, I can't share right now.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, while we're waiting for the song to play, right? Tomorrow, June 16th, will mark the 77th anniversary of the Enmore Martyrs in Guyana, where 5 protesting sugarcane workers were gunned down in 1948 by the colonial police. And that was a watershed moment in the history of Guyana, which we must never forget. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the 264th edition of our ICC Thought Leaders Forum, and we wish to sincerely thank all of you who have contributed in whatever way to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian Diaspora Global Project. For 263 unbroken continuous weeks, we have been here every single Sunday. And in the past 5 years and 1 month, we have featured 1,277 presenters from all parts of the world speaking on 263 topics. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a weekly forum being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, a legally registered research and publishing company operating since 2010. And like today, we often partner now with the Amina Ghafoor Institute for the Study of Indentureship and its Legacies, led by Professor David Debidine, who has kindly joined us also. In order to continue this weekly program and to make it bigger and better, we are kindly asking for suggestions and volunteers. If you give a donation, your name will be placed on our poster and all promotional materials, and you can contact Dr. Kumar Mahabir for details. We also wish to note of our conference in and tour of South Africa, scheduled for August 2nd to the 14th this year. And if you're interested in participating, please let us know. So, ladies and gentlemen, if we have the song ready, beautiful.
काले रंग पे कोई भी रंग चढ़ा दो, उसका रंग काला ही रहता है। आज से तू हम सब के लिए, मेरे लिए मर गया है तू, मर गया है, मर गया है तू।
क्या पहचान तेरी जिए जिस सहारे पे तू पिता से वो सांस मिली है पिता रब तेरा ईश्वर अल्लाह जितने भी रब है नूर तेरा तुझ में ही सब है ओ ईश्वर अल्लाह जितने भी रब है नूर तेरा तुझ में ही सब है।
मैं तुमसे नहीं बॉस से मिलने आया हूं। एक गुंडे को कॉन्ट्रैक्ट देने आया हूं।
पिता के आशीर्वाद से तूने सब कुछ पाया है क्या लेकर तू आया जग में और
आप
क्या
हमारे दिल में
तूने
हो,
कमाया
हमारे
है।
तन मन हमारी रूह में हो, सब जगह हो बाबूजी।
पिता के आशीर्वाद से तूने सब कुछ
हमारे
पाया
नसीब।
है क्या लेकर तू आया जग में और क्या तूने कमाया है।
सुनी तो ये था ही, लेकिन काफिर बनाया आपने।
ईश्वर अल्लाह जितने भी रब है नूर तेरा तुझ में ही सब है।
Thank you, Navin. That was a very powerful display of what a father would be like. So I'll introduce our moderator today, who is Shalima Mohammed, the co-director of this ICC Zoom platform, who's a business teacher and researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. She obtained her master's degree in business psychology from Franklin University in the USA. Shalima, welcome.
Thank you so much, Shakir. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Namaste and a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for choosing to be here with us. Let me also extend Happy Father's Day greetings to everyone. And I also want to extend happy birthday to our Badavai, Muhammad Keshavji. The program is being recorded on Zoom and live streamed on the YouTube channel of the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center. Welcome to all of you on YouTube at this time. To avoid intrusions from trolls, our IT manager has muted everyone. Speakers, please do not admit anyone, do not unmute anyone, and do not allow anyone to share your screen. Thanks so much for your cooperation. Today, we are talking about the state of Indo-Caribbean writing in 2025. About 2 weeks ago, Alison Donnell launched a book titled Lost and Found, an A to Z of neglected writers of the English-speaking Caribbean. Her main aim is to highlight writers from the region whose work has been overlooked or forgotten. We have not read the book, but we are almost certain that none of the neglected writers include those of Indo-Caribbean heritage or anything about Indo-Caribbean identity. We would like to be proven wrong. While we are an ethnic minority in the Caribbean, we feel we should not be excluded. Our weekly Sunday webinars try to fill that gap of neglect and marginalization. Caribbean writing and discourses must present a full and comprehensive picture of this region's rich, extraordinary cultural and literary landscape. As Indo-Caribbean people, we insist that we must be properly acknowledged, recognized, and rewarded for our contributions and achievements. As we embark on this discussion, we are privileged to be joined by 4 distinguished panelists who have made significant contributions to the literary landscape. Together, they will provide unique insights into the evolution of Indo-Caribbean literature, its current state, and its promising future. We invite you, the audience, to engage with us throughout this conversation as we reflect on the challenges, triumphs, and transformative power of storytelling within our community. As is the custom, if you would like to say something, please raise your electronic hand, which you will find in the reactions button at the base of your screen. Thank you. So let me welcome our first speaker today, and he is Kevin Jared Hussein, author of the novel titled Hungry Ghosts, which won the 2024 OCM Bocas Prize for Fiction and the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. This novel was also longlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize. Welcome, Kevin. You have 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. My name is Kevin Jared Hussein. So I'm going to be upfront here. So I didn't prepare anything, but I'm prepared to take questions from any moderators. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So well, the name of this forum is, the state of Indo-Caribbean literature. And so I think that we're not poor for talent in the Caribbean, whether or not, we consider Indo-Caribbean literature any other type of Caribbean literature. The infrastructure, however, is what leaves much to be desired. Just to reiterate, who I am, how long I've been writing. So my latest book is Hungry Ghosts, and I have another one in the works, which might come out in a year or so. And just I usually, when I was say as to write a book, I don't go out and seek to say that I'm going to write about Indo-Trinidadian people, I'm going to write about Afro-Trinidadian people. It's not really something that comes to mind for me. And when I think about writing on the whole, I think what a lot of people think is interesting about the swing of my career is that I did not traditionally study literature in school. So I went to presentation college Chaguanas, and in the 90s up until the mid 2000s or so, early to mid 2000s, and literature wasn't offered as a subject in school there. In fact, you only did it in Form 1, and we only did, I don't know if we did any Caribbean. We did Steinbeck. I don't think we did any Caribbean literature books. That has changed since then. But at the time, it was not an option to write it for CXC. It was not an option to do it for, well, at the time, GCs, and obviously was not an option for me to study it in university because I didn't have the paper, I didn't have the subjects to do it. But I always enjoyed writing. I always enjoyed observation and listening to the people around me. And I grew up in a very large Hindu family, where I have, I would say, dozens of cousins, and I have many aunts and uncles and second cousins. And I had the privilege to know not just my grandmother and grandfather, but up to my great-great-grandmother was still alive, up until I was a teenager, and alive and well, which means, they could have told stories and, would have been coherent. So I grew up listening to a lot of these things, and I didn't really think, the idea never crossed me that I should translate this into writing. When I first got into writing at about 12 or 13 years old, it was actually due to the influence of the Japanese, because I enjoyed Japanese role-playing games, video games, and I wanted to write one of that of my own. I was heavily influenced by that. And I think like a few years down the line, you start to realize that, when you're writing these things, you're writing basically fan fiction, it gets pretty derivative, and you're just writing other people's ideas. When I was studying, I studied biology. There was something that I learned there, especially when we were studying like evolutionary phases, and it was about what actually separates, sociologically, what separated early humans from other types of organisms. And there's really only one thing that separates the, human society, or even hominid society, to what, let's say, dolphins even, or dogs, or wolves, or bacteria. And there's one thing that humans could have done that no other organism could have really done. And that is not just have a language, right? All animals have a particular language, just not in terms of syntax and words and grammar. They do have language. But what we have is the ability is to use language to pass on knowledge to future generations. So, for example, I can communicate with people today, but I can also read a written record, in an archive that it was recorded in 1940s or the 1830s, or even going back to even like a little, to medieval times. There's scripts and there's dissertations of those scripts. And that's the one thing that separates that separated human and hominid society. And back then, they would have drawings, but they could have passed on information to future generations. And that astounded me. I don't know. It seems like a fact that you would take, you would take for granted, but it was something for me that is the one thing that separates humans from all, not just mammals, but basically all other sentient organisms, that they can have language, but they can use that language to talk, to speak into the future, to go into the past and speak into the future. And when I learned that, I think that fact there, which I learned in a science class, is sort of what propelled me to dig into my own family history and the history of the village that I grew up in. And the village that I grew up in is a small village called Lapai Village, near the banks of the Carney River. And I realized that there was a lot, and at the time that the village was just 4 streets wide. And I realized that there was a lot of history there that really was just kept in, I guess what you would say is mental spaces. Like it wasn't officially archived, because somebody, some of the things, the stories that the old folks there would talk about, my grandparents, great grandparents. I felt like I never heard like that stuff in books. And I wasn't I would say I wasn't a big proponent of Caribbean literature at the time. And I didn't see it represented in literature like on the whole. So it was only when I read Harold Sonny Ladu's No Pain Like This Body. I don't have it on me now, but No Pain Like This Body is set in Indo-Trinidadian barrack society sometime in the very early 1900s. It's a fictional place called Tola, and deals with this family living in a barrack, and almost the entire book, I should say novella, because it's just about barely over 100 pages long, and the entire thing is set within this. And I'd never read anything like that before. I'd never even heard of this writer before. It's only just through casual conversation someone asked me if I ever heard of Harold Sonny Ladu, who's a Trinidadian writer who's living in Canada at the time. I say, no, I never heard of him. Who's Selvon, who's Nightfall and Lovelace, but never heard of this guy. And it's like, well, he really just had the one book. But he had two, but he really just had the one that people know. So I went out and I got it, and it's very difficult to get Caribbean literature in the bookstores in Trinidad, like the bookstore franchises, I should say. We have to rely on going into town, like into paper-based bookshop, to get these things. So accessibility to these books is quite poor, unless you can make it all the way to a library and hope that they have it there. So that's why I say the state of Indo-Caribbean literature, and this Caribbean literature on the whole, the talent pipeline is there. There's talent. The infrastructure is pretty poor when it comes to access and when it comes to advertising and marketing and even awarding, because I cannot remember the last time, forget Indo-Trinidad writer. I can't remember the last time a Trinidadian writer has received a national award in Trinidad. And so coming back to my point here, so I read this book and the No Pain Like This Body. And this thing blew me away. I read it in one sitting. And it was part horror, it was sort of part genre. It was written in third person, but it was narrated as if it was a child speaking. And it had this unique voice to it that I didn't think that Caribbean books could have. And the voice sort of reminded me of some of the books I used to read by Stephen King and Cormac McCarthy, these American writers. And that one book, and sometimes it just takes that one book, it just takes one book to open your eyes to see that maybe maybe there's a lot that I'm missing, that there's a lot that is beyond what we would call the old guard. And, that sort of led me to check out more unknown, lesser known authors and books, try to seek them out and see what they have tried. And some of it quite experimental, but there's always value to it. And I saw this as having innate value, because coming back to my point here, it is as if he was writing into the future. This book was written in the 60s or 70s or so. And I read this in the 2010s. It's 40 years later, writing into the future. And it's something that I aspire to do. What I tend to write is that to seek the past or to record the present and hope to write to the future. That any of my work or works that I help with could have that effect. Now, coming back to Ladu here, I said that he wrote one book, right? But he really has two. There's another book, and I have it here, is a book called Yesterdays. And it was published last year, republished, I should say, by Coach House Books as a Canadian publisher. And I had spoken about Harold Sunday Ladu before, and I'd written some things about him, and the publisher reached out to me because they wanted to reissue this book. And they said that, they'll send me a copy, and they wanted me to do the foreword for it. But from what I've heard from numerous people, and that probably includes, I'm not too sure if that includes Professor Ramchan, but I've spoken to several writers and publishers about it, and they didn't really seem to find much worth in the book. One fellow writer and poet that I spoke to found it heavily offensive. Now, my interest was already piqued because I like to explore offensive material. I myself don't get offended easily. So I said, okay, I'll give it a try. I'm not gonna promise I'm gonna write the foreword for it. I'm gonna give it a try and see. So I read it, and it was one of the most offensive books I ever read. Just to give you an idea of how this book is about a man basically who is using his latrine as currency for sexual favors. Basically, there's a character in there who is trying to male character who is trying to seduce basically all the other male characters in the book, plus the females. There's a gynecologist in there that molests that molests his patients. You could say almost everyone in the book is irredeemable. And one of the most interesting characters in the book is the son, the main son. I can't recall his name, but the main son in the book. He wants to go to Canada to start a school, a school of Hinduism that he hopes to basically start a cult that would bring in enough people so that he could overthrow Canada. That was the most interesting. I thought that alone could have been a novel, which I thought was very interesting. But I I think why I was offended by it is because I kind of saw people I grew up with, family members, like very similar. And at a point, I was like, maybe this is taking a step backwards when it comes to representing Indo-Trinidadians, because I said everyone here um, was basically a lech and a pervert. But I I gave it about 2, 3 days thinking. Usually, like when something strikes me strongly like this, I say that it has to have some kind of worth to it. And I was thinking back to a time I saw a video at the Cannes Film Festival, the one in France. And there was a movie that was playing there. I'm not too sure if it was Cannes, but it was one of the film festivals. And there was a movie that was playing there about Asian Americans, and basically it was about an Asian American gang. And the director went up to speak, and he got a question. And the question was, do you think this is the proper way to portray Asian Americans, as being in this gang? And a critic stood up and said, the characters should just be the characters. They shouldn't have the weight of all of that on them. Let the characters breathe, let the characters be the characters. And I came back to yesterday's and I agreed to write the forward. I tell them it would be a highly positive forward for it. But I was really thinking about it, and is, you know what, why not? Why can't these characters in this book yesterday's, this book by this man Harrison Ilado, why can't the characters just be who they are? If they have to be as terrible and perverted and lecherous as they are, why can't they be that? And why can't they take that step and just be absolutely irredeemable? I don't have to like it. I don't think anybody has to like it. But I think, like, in the name of, experimentation and art and literature, you can absolutely have characters represented in any type of way. The only time I think that may come up as a problem is if there's improper research or there's actual contradictions in the text. But why do we have to just write prestigious literature? Why can't it be fully comedic or farcical even? So there's a lot that's there, and there's a lot that I too want to continue exploring. So when I was writing Hungry Ghosts, I basically took all of this information. I sat down and interviewed many people from the village, sometimes up to 5 hours. I was kind of surprised, but people would sit down and talk for long periods of time until they realize that it might end up in a book. Then they start to get quiet. And but the trick is you ask them to talk about other people and they would talk endlessly, just not about themselves. So you ask one neighbor to talk about the other one. You mightn't get, the full story, but you get something. And there was something that speaks to it about, I guess, Indo-Trinidadian people back in the barrack life. And there's one story that was told to me by my father-in-law, David Subran, who I think is in his room right now. He was talking about a guy who was living in a barrack, and I think he was working as a projectionist in the cinema. And he would have some money, but one thing that he liked to have is movie posters. And if he was to visualize the inside of a barrack room, we would visualize absolute poverty. We would visualize malaise and malady and sickness and discomfort. But then you have, it is a error to think to relegate one image to an entire group of people. So I kept this image in mind of this guy having movie posters. Maybe Rita Hayworth, maybe John Wayne, but he had these movie posters on the barrack wall. And and that to me is like, just like a teenager putting up their favorite rock star or their favorite hip hop artist. And it's like that. It's like there's ambition, there's individuality, and we have to look to seek that to try to get to the individual, not just a broad group of people, but the individual within that group, and see how we can get to the heart of their plight. So that's always my mission when it comes to writing.
Excellent, Kevin. May I ask you to please give us a reading from Hungry Goose?
Sure. So I'll just read the very beginning.
Sure.
Four boys ventured to the river to perform a blood oath, 2 brothers and 2 cousins. The brothers were twins, both 15, the cousins 14 and 13. They passed around a boning knife, making clean cuts across their palms. The blood bubbled to the surface like their veins were boiling. They let the blood drip into a stolen bottle of cow's milk. They drank, passing the bottle around until all was gone. Then they hugged each other a minute at a time, holding on tight as if the world were ending. When it was over, the rains came down so hard that the 4 boys thought the clouds would fall as well. The force of the water stung the wounds and washed them clean. The older brother christened their union with a name, Kobo, for the black vulture, a carrion feeder, a bird that stays alive by seeking the dead. Why not an ibis or a kingfisher or a peacock? Because a kobo will always be a kobo. Even if it trades its black feathers for peacocks, it must eat corpses for breakfast, realizing those too are meals fit for kings. For what is a king but one who is nourished by his kingdom, one that circles overhead making his presence known? A kobo will always be a kobo, hated by the world that it will eventually eat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What was your motivation for writing about that?
About the book itself, or that particular passage?
That particular passage.
That particular passage, the kobo, as I said, I studied biology. And in biology, you have a hierarchy, you have the food web and the food chain. And what you have separate from the, at the top, you have the apex predators. At the bottom, you would have the producers like the plants, but always separate from that, you would have your decomposers and your detritivores. So this is like bacteria, detritus feeders like earthworms, like vultures, and they would always be kind of separate from the rest of them. And I think about like, we sort of revile a lot of these creatures, like the vultures, the kobo. And I was thinking about a group of boys that would not revile it, but that would revere it in a way that they would identify with that. And the kobo, in a way, is probably more of a national bird than we think, because it is ubiquitous. We see it all the time. Yeah, but it's a despised bird. And I wanted to have a group of boys that would identify with this bird. I think it's an image that's readily identifiable with Trinidadians.
Very true. Thank you. Ryan has a question for you. Ryan, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Alama. Kevin, you said something interesting. I can't quite. First of all, let me just say thanks for being here. Because when I reached out to you, I know that your schedule is incredibly hectic, and for you to make time to do this really means a lot. So first of all, thank you very much for doing this for the little time that you have. But you said something interesting, because my love for literature really took a different turn in secondary school. And in fact, I don't think I would have probably even written a book or really loved literature in the way that I do if it wasn't for secondary school. And to hear that, West Indian literature really wasn't present in the way that it is now in school. How did you develop and harness that passion for writing when something as important as literature, for writers anyway, wasn't present in school?
Thank you, Ryan. And yes, it's a pleasure to be here regardless of my schedule. So Let me just ask you one thing. You've been I haven't read your novel yet, but I've read about it. I've read articles about it. You've been working on your novel for about more than a decade, right?
16 years, yeah.
16 years. So that's what I read. Like that's 15, 16 years. And so there's something deep in you, despite wherever your life went, despite whatever career choices that you would have made, whether it would have been literary or non-literary, there would have been something there deep in you that wanted to do this. And sometimes you can identify the source of that spark, and sometimes it's not one single source. Sometimes there's many different things. So for me, so in school, I would actually say if I was to study literature in school, I'm not sure if I would be a writer because literature for me, school wasn't fun. I mean, I enjoy learning about science, throughout. It's not that it's not fun, but it's work. And literature to me was always the play part of it. What I saw was, I don't know, it was the ability. I think I used to see movies and TV shows, and there were maybe a lot more writers on TV, like portrait on TV back then, and maybe not, the most accurate thing, but you'd see a writer in a cabin, hunkered down, and they'd be working on this manuscript on this old typewriter. And there was something about that you could start with this blank page, and nobody could tell you what to do with this blank page. And you could go anywhere with this. You could go down any road with this. And there's something about that was remarkable to me. So it was fun. When I used to come home from school, before I do my homework, I would, like in Form 1, when I was like 12, I'd write about 500 words of whatever. And I know that nobody was gonna grade it at the end of the day. I'm not sure if I would have the same, the same drive if I knew someone's gonna be looking at it and critiquing it. So it was multiple things that led to it. But it wasn't one I could think about particular books that swayed me in certain directions. But for me to start writing, I think that there's a sort of calling. There's something in you that wants to look at that blank page and wants to fill it. And I said, a part of me is that I know that if I write it down, it's going to be there in the future. Whether or not someone's going to read it or not, whether someone's going to discover it or not, I just like that idea of recording.
Very good. Thank you. Kevin, you talked about leaving something for future generations. The final question to you, what do you hope to leave for future generations?
What I hope to leave for future generations, I mean, there's a lot of my work. Just a few of my other books. I published a book called The Repenters with People Tree Press, and a book called The Beast of Cuckoo with Blue Banyan Press in Jamaica. This is a young adult book. And I'll just use this one as an example. This was published about 10 years ago. And I only recently went to a school was doing it, and they asked me to come. And they did these, I don't know what they call them, but they did portraits of each character, but the portraits were like emotional portraits. They weren't like they didn't represent the physicality of the character. They represent like what the character was going through. I thought that was so fascinating that these and the kids were like 14, 15 or so, and they were doing this. And the book here, The Beast of Cuckoo, is a crime book. It's a crime mystery book. Basically, what I was thinking about when I was writing this is like, if Nancy Drew was a Trinidadian, would Nancy Drew be able to solve any crimes in Trinidad? And that led me down a whole road to writing this, to see like what problems a little girl would run into solving a murder in Trinidad. And that book has always connected with kids for some reason. And then those kids have grown up, and I've met some of them, and some of them say that they, that book, they read that when I was like 10 years ago, when I was like 13. And it was like, that really got them to try other books. Some of them, it got them to write. And I think it's like this forward motion in a way that I like, because I know that I said for about Harold Sunny Ladu. For me, I don't think Harold Sunny Ladu was thinking, oh, I'm gonna write this book so that other people could read it and then they want to write. But it was a, maybe an unintentional effect. I hope that whatever I put out there has similar unintentional effects. That it inspires not just writing and reading, but other values or other characteristics or traits that they find in the book. Nebulous things, but that's what I hope. The record, put it out there and see what it does in the future.
Excellent. So I want to thank you very much for a very revealing presentation. We've gotten to know a lot more about you, the author, and thank you very much for doing that reading from your book, Hungry Ghosts. I hope it sells well.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, let's move on now to our second speaker, and this is Ellie Nyland. She's a Guyanese-born, England-based poet, playwright, and teacher. In 2006, her second poetry collection won the Guyana Prize for Literature, and in 2023, she received the Best First Book Prize for Fiction. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm delighted and I appreciate very, very much being invited to speak here today. I'll start off because for time management, I'll talk very, very briefly about myself, very briefly. Okay, I am a very late starter and I didn't write until my late 40s. It was like a new freedom for me. It was with an exercise book and a pen, opened the door to another world. And in fact, it was grief that provoked me to scribble. It was loss, that turmoil of loss, it dwarfed me. Led to a lot of emotional chaos. So it was a little bit of private time. And later on, I found it was a release to write. It gave me a sort of detachment from everyday life's clutter. And it was private. I put them all in a box, all my scribbles and letters. I wrote to the living and the dead. And eventually, it was published, one collection, and then it became a little itch that hasn't stopped. But it was also at times a celebration, all set in domestic, everyday settings that everyone can relate to. And at the time when I was writing, my head was like a sorting office. It's full of rubbish, and it became a very slow process. And I got into it. I had a few concerns that I've had my whole life, and that is that I tried to live with the reality of a scattered family still. That loss that links us and binds us, that stays with me. It gives me a sense of unbelonging. And when I feel like that, I cannot write. And the words just flare up and they fade away. I spent a lot of years trying to live with absence, trying to renounce pessimism, if you like, and trying to remember the best of what I left behind in Guyana in my childhood years. Yes, it's not just a physical dislocation being away from my birthplace. It's in a way a psychic dislocation as well. I have a few other concerns. They're ancient. And one of them is sometimes you're trying to sleep and you're on the crest of a phrase, if you like. and it disappears. And it's like memory loss, and you get up and you're really frustrated because you didn't get up in the night to scribble it. And another little difficulty is I lost a whole collection on the computer because I'm, if you like, illiterate. And it's that deficiency that I have with technology. And I never did recover the collection again. So that's just a tiny little bit of me. I don't have anything much else that I'd like to say, except my work has strong autobiographical elements because I live in 2 languages, and I think I was born with a restlessness. When I left Guyana as a young girl of 13, I didn't just lose a family tree. I lost a whole bloody forest of family, friends, places. And I write and I use lots of Creole because it's my natural tongue. It's something that's embedded in me. It's me. It's also a refuge. It's very sustaining. And Creole for me, there's a calypso in the words. They're very magnetic also when you write them. It's exciting, it's nourishing for me. I cannot write without using Creole. It's who I am. The Creole, some of the words are magnetic. They're like sequins. There's a splash of color in many, many words. It's just very briefly to tell you, I've always loved the word cantankerous. When my granny said so-and-so's cantankerous, or them wrong and strong, them rambunctious. I was only a little kid. I've never forgotten it. There's a cocktail of music in certain words. I would also hear the word biggity, them biggity. And I didn't know what it meant. Them poor great. It means poor people are being big shots. And I learned a lot. And I didn't know much. But I also learned as a child that my great grandma, we used to say Ma and then old Ma. And so my great grandma, I learned later, on her papers, it said she was 9 years old when she went to Guyana with her parents. And next to that, it said fit for field work. And so indentureship, that word that came later to me, became very, very distressing. And my grandparents not having shoes and no tarmac on the road. They were peasant farmers. They struggled. And me as a child, I was just happy because I could climb a tree. And I didn't think about the smell of cow dung. I was just thinking we're going to have sweet kheer and milk in our tea. Yes, I have significant, like everybody else, we all have significant ties to certain places. But the place of my birth was a tiny little village, number 36 village. And 2 minutes away was my grandma's house, and then an auntie and an uncle. You called everyone auntie and uncle. That Creole that I grew up with, eating baigan and bhaji, dal and rice people, catching buck crab and so on. That's my life. That's the joyous part of my life. And I didn't have any choice in the matter when I was asked to leave when Guyana was in nationwide turmoil and the prognosis was very poor for the whole country. I was a young teenager and my family left. So Creole, hot steaming cow dung, the smell of neem to chase away mosquitoes, and the pond coated with water lilies. Wrap it all up, and it's my life. And that's what I write about. I'd like, if you don't mind, to just read Looking at the Time.
I would love that. Thank you.
I'd just like to read from Bone Soup, where all I set out to capture a child's sense of going on a journey, and I tried desperately to capture being a small boy and to separate myself from that. Bone Soup. Sunday was soup day, and it really was one pot feed all, simply because Granny or Baby, with or without teeth, could share. Religiously, every week, out came the 6-pint soup pot with its dented lid. It was her mother's pot and her grandmother's pot before her. That damn pot was like a member of the family. Making the soup satisfied her completely. Somehow, she wasn't just feeding us. She was curing us and protecting us too. The wisdom of women, the wisdom of ages, distilled into a single cauldron. Part of the ceremony was the placing of it in the middle of the table. Every ingredient was added with oohs and ahs as it landed with a plink plonk in the water. She tried to explain its function. 1 wiri wiri pepper for blood circulation, a couple of thyme leaves for fragrance, and a rosary of shallots, which were good for everything. The ground provisions were for energy: curly, salted pigtail, scored or chopped for flavor, and a bone or two boiling for the marrow, which give you health and strength. She'd also add a couple of slimy okras and eddos from the yard, and a handful of pearl barley, which was a heaven-sent blessing, as was the right plantain or a stick of cassava, if she could get it. Finally, she'd dribble in half a spoon of black pepper, and I always hoped she'd forget the dumplings, which were horrible brown things that bounced before sinking out of sight. If you ever complained or took too long to eat, she used to ask in a voice that had lost its vitality, "When you intend to done away with that fussy sour face, huh? Is a grown a hearing from you?" While all them other families had gone to church, I'd be getting my own sermon right there at home, rocking on her heels, hands in her apron. She'd tune up with the first epistle. A pair of hands flung apart in the air. "Child, you're trying to exhaust my patience and defile this holy day, or what?" See how, like any good preacher worth his collection plate, she moves now from wrath to remorse. Good, fresh, nourishing food. Then she changes into guilt-inducing rhythmical psalm, shaking her head right through. Old-time days, Granny and me only had a handful of chicken foot in this pot, and half a cow heel, and maybe a bird pepper when we lucky. One time we glad to catch a couple cricketer snails to throw in. The pot boiled, and so did she, on and on. Some people got nothing. Boy, you complain when you find little onion on your plate. Your mouth always swell up when I say you must eat the crust of the bread. Her favorite, though, was a kind of creed in truth, almost biblical in its proportions. As her head inclined towards the roof, I used to mouth the words to myself. I believe you not know when you're dead good till you're dead bad. It was so scarce now, and so dear too. Eat what I put on the plate, because it's so blasted dear, and like bill coming mountain and another dollar headache there. You sense that certain moments required only silence, though I learned to murmur appreciatively as she ladled it out. The secret was to wait. Then as soon as she turned her back, you could lose a dumpling. Where? To bite one into little pieces and pelt it out of the window was a great accomplishment. The chickens would take care of the evidence. I wouldn't have thought much more about the soup, except that I suddenly became responsible for procuring its ingredients. My jobs were growing in importance all the time, though the day she asked me to deliver a note to Mr. Humphrey the butcher still makes me proud. Now, here I was being trusted to go on a long-distance errand alone. Lift up your foot. What good? Go straight there and come back safe, she pleaded. I was determined to prove that I was equal to the responsibility. Please pick up your foot, son. Take a couple wide strides, and you want me reach back home quick. That is what me want. Watch out for crab dog, and don't like how but you. You hearing me good? I'll have to skip a few chapters because of time. So I went to Mr. Humphrey the butcher. The butcher's shop had a beautiful blue door, reminding me of the words lapis lazuli, which hinted at something sacred. I opened it and ducked inside, where it was dim and warm and a little sour. The place was full of animals who had once navigated the traffic, the forest, the fields. Their carcasses hung in a gallery of death, their brick red meat marbled with yellowed white fat. My gaze settled momentarily on a piglet, its head minus the snout, legs severed, hanging upside down on an S-shaped silver hook. On a cocoa-colored chopping block, where the hacking of flesh took place, another head was rested, tilted back with its eye hanging out of its socket. Along one wall were sheep, suspended, weeping blood and dripping snot. The intestines, a sea of scooped out snakes, were all coiled up in a bowl on the counter. I peered at the thighs of cows ranged along the other wall, their quartered heels and their rib bones looking like pipes on hollow bamboo columns. There were plucked chickens with wrinkled eyelids and protruding tongues, and I wondered if their legs were tied up with string before they died, or if they lay kicking around and waving about. Except for the low hum of a single fluorescent light, the animals hung in silence. Standing there in quiet contemplation, I was interrupted by a sudden slush of guts on the butcher side of the counter, and the smell suddenly became more sour. Mr. Humphrey walked out, wiping a pair of leathery old hands. He said, "If you don't eat them, they'll eat you." And he smiled. I searched for something to say, but I couldn't think of anything, so I said thanks. I handed him the note. While he read it and looked around, I glimpsed the galvanized bucket, the buckets that were full of blood. Blood used to make black pudding. Best thing for virility, a huge sign declared. Some female customers had signed the notice, attesting to its truth. I was given a parcel tied with brown twine, and on my way out of the shop, I noticed the dogs fighting outside, roused by the incense of blood. Before long, the trip to Mr. Humphrey had become my regular job, and I went proudly clutching the note every 2 weeks on a Saturday at 5 o'clock sharp, just at closing time. And I always seemed to walk in immediately into his gaze, and I would dutifully hand him the note, which had been folded and placed into a ship matchbox, and he'd wipe his hands on the stained apron. He unfolded the note, stroked the sides of his moustache, and gave me a parcel bound with brown twine. I'll just get to the end chapter. About a year or so later, when I learned to read the joined up scribbles of handwriting, I sneaked a peep at a note before handing it over to Mr. Humphrey. And it said, "Please, can you give my son Alfred a few scraps and a couple of small bones for the dog?" I shivered like a bat. I admit I was ashamed at first. And then I had a good laugh in the fading light. You see, what Mr. Humphrey didn't know is that we never had a dog. Mommy was too proud to let the butcher know how poor we were. But she saved us from humiliations large and small, from begging and from debt. I was shocked at the time, and I felt the sting of shame, it's true. But when I look back now, I smile and I admire her for her resourcefulness. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. Shakira, why don't you express what you just said?
I laughed because it so reminded me of my mother, of mommy. I wrote, you are a great storyteller, a story weaver. You can tell when it's a good book because you feel as if you're there and you don't want to leave your hero or the plot line. So thank
bless
you.
That's really, really kind of you. I tried very hard to be a little boy, and I wrote it just because Stone Soup is an ancient story, and I always try to start with a real incident. And yes, a child did go to the butcher and say, "Can I have a bone for my dog?" And his mum did put it in the soup. And I can't work without a sense of humor either. And children are naughty, and yes, I've eaten hard dumplings, and I can't make them. But thank you for saying so.
It was it was really wonderful listening to you. I want to invite MK. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Is it Ellie? Do you mind if I call you Ellie?
No, not sure, not sure.
It's brilliant, you know. You reminded me of something that was told to me when I qualified in England as a lawyer, and I wanted to work in the International Civil Service. And a black man from Ghana, who was in the International Civil Service, told me, "Go back to Africa and smell the soil of Africa. Smell the soil of Africa." Being of Indian origin, years later, I went to India and I smelt the soil of India. When I got out of Bombay, I smelt the sweat, the sewage, the spices, the post-monsoon rain, you know, the mopping of the Bombay airport. That got into my blood for me to search for my identity. And I think that the way you describe that story so beautifully reminds me of all mothers. They want to protect the dignity of their children, not to be exposed to the ravages of poverty.
Oh,
And yet what they did for us is what you said. You didn't know about those difficulties. You just saw the beautiful kheer. You
yes,
saw the sweet milk.
yes, yes.
I think you really are touching the core of humanity. I mean,
Oh,
this is a
bless
book
you.
that in today's children will lap it up. Anywhere in the diaspora, they'll lap it up. Thank you. I just wanted to mention that every word you mentioned, I was just agape. I was just full of admiration.
You're very, very, very kind, and I'm delighted that I was invited here. And time doesn't allow me to read any more Creole work, but perhaps another time. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. And I have to ask you, to what extent have you gotten some degree of relief from these concerns, as you call it? To what extent has your writing helped you to get some degree of relief?
It's when I want to escape from anything, it doesn't matter what responsibilities I have. And when I don't want to go to the shop and I don't want to cook, I hide and I write. But I work very, very slowly. And as I said, I'm illiterate with, well, I can do the
Technology.
washing. Yeah, all of it. And I do many, many things and they're left halfway. So I have to work on another collection.
Right.
I have to finish it. And I think it would only be fair to say that when I won a prize, I was quite overwhelmed. And I couldn't sit around with a piece of paper and a pen anymore for a long, long time. I just carried on smoking and drinking tea. But when I didn't do poetry and I started prose, I'd written many prose pieces for other programs and so on. But to put a whole collection together was really tough. And if I'd known what I was embarking on, I probably would have gone under the table. And when it was finished, you start all over again and start picking bits and pieces. Yes, and when it won the prize, I don't know. I'm always shocked that I think I have a huge amount of disbelief for a very, very long time. But I'll carry on. And I have to write. I have to use Creole. And thank you
so
very much.
appreciate it. We so appreciate it. Where can readers get access to your writings?
From the Caribbean Press. From the Caribbean Press website.
Okay. Only from that source? Only from that source? CaribbeanPress.org. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. You have a number of compliments in the chat to read. I want to thank you very much for sharing with us today and for giving us any of your time at all. We really appreciate it.
I'm glad you laughed.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we move on now to our third speaker. And this is Professor Kenneth Ramchand from right here in Trinidad and Tobago. He's widely regarded as arguably, quote unquote, arguably the most prominent living critic of Caribbean fiction, end quote. His seminal work on the West Indian novel established West Indian literature as an academic discipline. And we're so happy to have him. Welcome, Professor Ramchand. Are you able to unmute your mic?
Right. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now, yes.
Okay, so what I'm gonna do is make 2 or 3 points, and I can be stopped as we go along, anybody who wants clarification or objection. So when we talk about Indian writing in English in Trinidad, certain names come to mind. You think of V.S. Naipaul, you think of Shiva Naipaul, you think of Sam Salvon, half Indian, half Scottish man. And if you have a little cultural knowledge, you think of C. Prasad Naipaul, the father of Vidya. And in a way, Indian writing in English took off with C. Prasad Naipaul. If you like, he's the father of writing in English by Trinidadians of Indian origin. And he was that because he was a magnificent journalist in the 1930s, a fine short story writer. He produced the first book of short stories by an Indian writer in Trinidad that came out in 1943. And he wrote some wonderful letters to his son in the collection, Letters Between a Father and a Son. But what is interesting is where he was coming from. That before C. Prasad came into prominence as a journalist for the Trinidad Guardian, and incidentally, that was another first. He was the first person of Indian origin to become a staff writer in what people used to call the main Trinidad newspapers. C. Prasad contributed to other magazines which were largely run by Indians before, but once he got the job with the Guardian, his career took off. And that was a first. But it's not a great picture because there were people writing, there were Indians writing in English before C. Prasad Naipaul. There were Indians writing at the same time that Vidya and Selvan and Shiva were writing. And there's a new wave of writing ever since, I would say, dominated by our female writers. So the scene is much broader than people think, and it has a longer life than people realize. Just to drive home the point about what has unfolded since the Naipauls and the Selvans, just calling some names: Rajande Ramkisun Chen, Rabindranath Maharaj, Shivani Ramlochan, Andre Bagu, a chap called McGee, who had a splendid column in The Guardian, Isaiah Budu, Vani Kapildev, Ingrid Prasad, Celeste Mohammed, Jennifer Rahim, Claire Adam, Lakshmi Prasad, Shani Mutu. I could keep calling them more and more and more names to tell you that the field is very rich at present. And I think the field is rich because it has brilliant antecedents, people who came before.
Professor Ramchan, why was C. Prasad Naipaul's writing highlighted so much as opposed to the others who wrote in English at the time?
Because he was a better writer.
Better in what way?
He had a better control of language. He had a larger vision of society. He really had something to say about things that were larger than himself and to which he would like to belong. Right? He had humility, and he was obsessed with the muse. You know, all his life, he just wanted to be a writer, and he took a lot of pain and a lot of trouble to be it. So it's a hard, when you ask, why was he a better writer? You stump me out there, because a better writer means all of the things I've said. This was a person who has a vision of the world, a vision of himself, a vision of the world around him, and he's writing about it, not out of a small ego, but out of a kind of humility. How do I belong? Where do I belong? what is this world in which I find myself? Are you okay with that for
Yeah, thank you.
on C Prasad?
Thank you.
And I will, in a little while, want to say something about the most original, the most ambitious, the most possessed of all writers, a person who really hasn't got the credit or the understanding that he deserves. I refer to Harold Sonny Ladu, whose project, before they killed him, whose project was to write an epic of the Indian presence in Trinidad, beginning in the 1900s and tracing all the vagaries of Indian life to the point of emigration in Canada in the 1970s. That's the epic he had in mind. And so his first novel, No Pain Like This Body, is set in 1905. His second novel, Yesterdays, is set in 1955. And he has some short stories that were published. Some of them were written earlier, but published. One was set in Canada, and two were back in Trinidad. Because he had that project, he focused on a very specific group. And he also focused on a very specific place. So when I read him, I know this is Sonny Ladu country. This is the world, the fictional world he has invented, and it's very, very close to the real world that he knew down there. And the people he's writing about, it causes embarrassment. I heard Jared say that this was a kind of, he was offended by it, and then he's not offended by it. Whatever it is, he found something in it to want to write the introduction to a reprint. I have never been offended by anything Sonny Ladu wrote, because I understand that he was writing about the lowest of the low. He was writing about Indians who didn't even have a caste. These jungles or hill people who came from the wilds and the bush. These were the people he was writing about. And they are part of the numbers of Indians who came to Trinidad. And if we repress them, as many of our writers do, and pretend that they never existed, and pretend that they are not part of our id, and we have to come to terms with our id. I think that one of the reasons why Indians in Trinidad are so brittle is that they do not come to terms with that horrible past, and they don't want to see it. That was the past, and that was something that made us what we are. So for me, Harold Ladu was opening up new dimensions of Indianness and forcing the Indians of his time to come to terms to what they really were. We were not just fellas who plant cane and buy shop and make money and buy a big house in Port of Spain. There are people, there are real people there at rock bottom who had a wonderful capacity, vulgar as they might be, a wonderful capacity for life, a kind of energy, a kind of relish, all those sexual escapades and so on. Yes, I wouldn't like my children to read all of those, or my grandchildren, but when they get a little older, they should. So to me, I'll come to Ladu in a minute, just to talk a little bit about his writing and to read 2 paragraphs from his work. Before I go to Laddu, and to talk about the long history of writing in English by people of Indian origin in Trinidad, just a couple of footnotes that the first Indian newspaper came out in 1898. It's called the Indian Kohinoor Gazette. It started off as a daily and then became a weekly. It had a Hindi edition and it had an English edition. Well, it didn't last long, lasted 1 year. After that, we had the East Indian Herald, which came out in 1919. We had the East Indian Patriot, which came out in 1921. And then you had a magazine, which is one of the most important documents in our cultural history. It is called the East Indian Weekly, and it ran from 1928 to 1932. And that magazine was the most and first serious attempt to create an intellectual life and to bring Indian minds together and to prepare the ground for Indian writing and Indian achievements in many fields. And one of its prominent writers was Adrian Kola Rienzi. Another one was F.E.M. Hussain. Just think of any Indian of the 1920s and 30s who had a good mind, and you go to the East Indian Weekly, you see he has written something. And what the editor, C.B. Mathura, did, Mathura went on to become a member of the city council. He went up for elections and so on. What Mathura had in mind was his father had a dry goods store in Chaguanas called the Chaguanas Emporium. And he inherited it. And he made a reading room and a library in the Emporium. He used to import books from India, America, England, and every part of the world where there were Indian books and magazines, and make them available for people to come and read and talk. So this man, we talk about the Beacon in Trinidad with C.L.R. James and Alfred Mendez. The Beacon, I'm sorry to say, was the East Indian Weekly was greater than the Beacon. And it was greater than the Beacon because it had a wider reading public, and more important, it reached out to ordinary people and put ordinary people in touch with what the more educated members of the society. I'm so sorry to read about how it died. It just, this is Trinidad, nothing lives so very long. Right? We don't support things, okay? But they did a magnificent job of staying alive for so long and discussing the place of Indians in Trinidad, our relationship to India, where do we fit in this society that we are now, how being Trinidadians do we relate to India, all the questions that we still haven't answered. The East Indian Weekly raised them. And that intellectual ferment created by the East Indian Weekly was an inspiration to people. And that is why once the writing started to flow, it flowed and flowed and flowed. So I think that this little bit of history, I think people can go and read a book by Chris Rampersad called Finding a Place, which deals with from the Indian Kohinoor right down to the emergence of Sri Prasad Naipaul. And it was a good book. She was my graduate student. I worked with her. She did the work. I worked with her, and that's the book she produced. And I feel that's a very good handbook if you want to know about Indian writing in English and the culture of Trinidadians of Indian origin and the kinds of hopes of these people. That's a good starting point. And Professor Samaru has written a brilliant article about the East Indian Weekly in detail, giving you what it said, and so on and so on, and who were the writers. And I feel that is part of the background. We can't just go dry so and talk about what is happening now. We have to see the tradition. We have to link the previous writers with the present writers. You measure one against the other. You see why it has to be different now. Okay? And
Can I ask you to pause for a cause?
to what?
The pause for a cause. Thank you, because I've had Dr. Muhammad Keshavji, also an author, waiting to ask you a question for the longest while. MK, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ramchandran. I'm absolutely fascinated by what you said. I just want to make two small comments. You know, we in Africa are made to understand that there was not a discursive tradition among the Indians in the Caribbean, sadly so. And I'm so fascinated to hear what you said. Why has this not come in the public domain? In any discourse today, one normally gets the idea that the only person who was an intellectual in that firmament was V.S. Naipaul. And I think to a great extent, Naipaul spoke about the Indian denial of the lower echelons of society. So here you have a diasporic writer talking to the global Indian diaspora of how we could not relate to India. And yet within Trinidad, you had that same sort of conundrum. And I think that, don't you think there is an opportunity for a study to be conducted and publicized about this fascinating tradition? Because my own understanding was that when C.F. Andrews spoke about Gandhi, people like C.L.R. James and George Padmore, all of them thought these crumbling, very thin-looking laborers Indians, what do they know about life? And yet you're telling me there's this rich harvest. I'm just wondering, how can this all be brought in the public domain to give a more equal, balanced understanding of the East Asian contribution?
Let's balance the thing that it is a fact that by the 1930s, Trinidadians of Indian origin were at least 1/3 of the population. And still, people thought about them as a minority. They were not a minority. They were a major component of the population. And people didn't know much about him. That is why C. Prasad was so important, that his journalism brought the Indians into the minds of the rest of the population. And the Beacon Group recognized that they knew nothing, and they had an Indian section in the Beacon. They created a special section in the Beacon to talk about Indians and Indians of the past, Indians from India, and I know they cultivated it, but of course, they didn't have too many Indians writing it. So if Mrs. Beatrice Gregg, with all the goodwill in the world, wants to explain about the Indian sus, there's only so much she could say. But the intention was there. And that really was. And C. Prasad Naipaul was asked to write articles about Indian music. He wrote articles about the pan. He wrote about calypso. So it really began then. And Trinidad is such a naughty place, and we have settled down into racial voting, and we play the race thing when it suits us. But if you come here, you would see that there's a lot of mixing going on. There's a lot of fusion. You see the fusion in the foods. You see the fusion in music. You see the fusion in dance. It's happening. It's a natural process. And people seem to think, I mean, I get very vexed when people tell me I'm living in a diaspora. I don't live in a diaspora. I was born here. This is my place. I am a Trinidadian just as much as any other Trinidadian, but I happen to be a slightly different Trinidadian because I am not letting go of my Indian origins. I'm not ashamed of my Indian origins. I am a Trinidadian of Indian origin. There are Trinidadians of French origin. There are Trinidadians of Chinese origin. We're all Trinidadians. And the society as a whole has not got around to accepting itself and to see that the energy and richness of our culture comes from our participating in one another's culture. You be you and I'll be me, but we can all be Trinidadians still. I don't think that this society has got there yet. And sometimes you feel they don't really want to get there. There's so many vested interests, so many benefit from the lack of unity, especially politicians, that I don't know if we would ever break through. But the writers, all our writers, or major writers of African and Indian origin, write about this problem, but nobody's listening to them.
Thank you very much. I want to ask Ryan. Ryan, please hold your thought because I want to introduce you very soon and to make your contribution. So let's just take a question from Jay Nair, and Ryan, if it's okay, you can probably pose your question or make your comment for Professor Ramchand at that time. Is that okay with you?
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you. So Jay, let's have a quick question or comment from you. Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead,
Okay.
Jay.
Two questions. One, when Mahatma Gandhi started his newspaper in Natal in the 1900s, just after the 1900s, before he left for India. Actually, it's between 1890s and 19 something. He started the Indian Opinion, and he tried to write and bring the Indians together. Because the way Mr. Ramchand is talking about what's happening in Trinidad in those days, there was what we call separate development in the raw stages, because the Afrikaner government in South Africa used that model and divided us. Actually, they learned it from Canada because Canada had separate nations. They used that separate development policy and ran the country with 4 different racial groups and kept them divided, and always used that and carried on. So 2 things. How did the Indian Opinion newspaper that was started by Mahatma Gandhi infiltrate itself into the Trinidadian mold, or the Indo-Caribbean mold in the 1900s?
I don't know how long that magazine lasted. Remember, the East Indian Weekly began in 1928. So I have a feeling that Gandhi would not have been doing that magazine in 1928.
No, he did it earlier.
Yes, but the East Indian Weekly was a great follower of Mahatma Gandhi and his writing.
Exactly, you got the point.
And they were really worked up about the Indian struggle for independence.
Right.
And it was their understanding of that struggle for independence that made them see that they had a place and they have to fight for independence too, and they have to fight for their place
I'd love to sit and talk to you.
Yes. So I'm a kind of optimist in that I wish to see a country where we're all Trinidadians and where we still have respect for our ancestry. We still recognize the way in which our ancestry has made us what we are. But this doesn't, in fact, our variety should be a source of strength, and it is. I'm an optimist. I still keep hoping that we would evolve to that condition. Because in the early days, for an Indian to become a Trinidadian, he had to pretend to drop his Indian culture and his Indian faith and all of that and say, I'm coming, I'm joining the brew. And in a novel by Earl Lovelace, there's an Indian man called Pariag who goes to a settlement in Labantil and tries to belong to it. It is largely an African settlement, Trinidad African settlement. He tries to belong to it, and he has a lot of trouble getting in because he's setting about it the wrong way. And late in his life, when he realized that he wasn't making headway, it was because he was doing what he thought was necessary, that he should forget his Indianness and just be like them. And later on, he says, I made a great mistake. I should have gone up to these fellas and said to them, I am Pariag. I come from a rural district called Newlands, and I'm living here, and I see you all are playing music. This is my sitar. I am bringing my sitar to the music. I'm not throwing aside my sitar and going to play shack shack in your band or pong bottle and spoon. I have a sitar and I am bringing it. Make room. I am bringing something to this society, and you all should be adaptable enough to accept it. So, as I said, I'm very optimistic that this could still happen, although I'm not sure with our greedy politicians it's going to. It suits the politician for us to
Yes.
vote according to race. But time,
Professor Ramchand, I want to thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure having you and hearing you on the program. And I know Lavanya is indicating that she has some questions, but we have just a short while to bring in our fourth speaker, and I'll ask you to please hold your questions, and hopefully we can have the pleasure of having Professor Ramchand respond after, if that's okay. Thank you very much, sir. Excellent presentation. So at this point in time, I want to bring on our fourth and final speaker, and this is Ryan Bechu, a multimedia journalist for the last 15 years in Trinidad and Tobago. He has produced 3 documentaries on religion, and in January, he published his debut novel titled An Unending Search. Ryan, I want to thank you very much for being here. I don't know if I will see you on CNC3 News tonight, but I look forward to seeing you all every night. Thanks for being here. Go ahead, please.
Shalima, thank you very much, Shalima, for that wonderful introduction. I'm not going to be very long. I do have a presentation that I whipped up. I'm not sure if it's okay to just get permission to share.
Certainly.
Yeah, that would help a little
Let me see
bit.
if Navin will allow.
Or I could just send it to Navin if you want.
Try it now. Do you have permission?
I could try now, yeah. No, they're still saying host disabled, participant
Host.
sharing.
Okay, Dr. Mahabir,
Yeah.
can you please allow Ryan to share
I'm
screen?
looking behind the scenes to get Navin to show it, but you can carry on meanwhile.
Yeah, sure. So thanks very much for having me on. First of all, it's really a little bit of an honor really to share any platform really with Professor Ken Ramchan, who really is one of the bedrocks when it comes to West Indian literature, and his contribution to West Indian literature really has paved the way for someone like me to be able to write and to read West Indian literature in a particular way. And also Kevin Jared Hussein. When I contacted Kevin, I was pleasantly surprised that he agreed. I didn't think that he would agree. But Kevin is one of our top writers. And in many ways, Kevin, and we called other names like Celeste, we call other names like Richard Charan. We call these names, and really they are a product of Naipaul. They are a product of Selvan, of these famed Indo-Caribbean writers. In many ways, they are. And I think that's something that ought to be explored more. That's something I'm sure that they themselves will admit. Harold, we talked about Harold Ladu and what he was able to accomplish in such a short life. When you look at his own story, and I don't think he lived past 30. Professor Ramchan could correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think he lived past 30. But Yesterday's and his first novel, are so key. And so, in my own story, what I found was that out of a love, particularly for Naipaul, but also for Selvan as well, I found myself writing this novel, An Unending Search, and that's what it really started. It was never meant to be published. It was, it was just out of a love for West Indian literature, a love for writing, and in many ways it was about just trying to be Naipaul as well, because what Naipaul and Selvan and what they did was they wrote about us. We had Enid Blyton, we had John Steinbeck, we had J.D. Salinger, we had Harper Lee, we had George Orwell, these terrific European and American writers. Thanks very much, Navin. We had these terrific European and American writers that made it. Their writing made their way to our shores here in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. But essentially, what Selvan and Naipaul did was that, we were able to connect. I was able to connect with what they were writing. They wrote about the very communities and the very towns and the very villages that I lived in. And because I was able to so intimately connect with what they were writing with, and in their own writing, I saw own stories in growing up in Princestown, for instance. Let's just take a book that Naipaul wrote. Let's just take Miguel Street, for example. Miguel Street is like any typical village in Trinidad and Tobago and around the Caribbean. I mean, few would argue with that. In every village, you have exciting times. You have times where people want to fight. You have people calling each other's nicknames like Bigfoot and Tall Man and all of those things. You have that in almost every village in the Caribbean. And so I was able to connect predominantly through Miguel Street. I was able to connect what was happening in my own small town. And that's why I would say, and you could move on to the other slide now. Thanks. And that's why I really felt, and the next slide, that's why I really felt that Naipaul and Selvan had a huge influence on me wanting to tell this story of my own hometown. And more than that, because I read so much of Naipaul and Selvan, it was difficult for me to write, even though I grew up in the 21st century. It was difficult for me to write from a perspective of cell phones and computers and the digital age, because in their writing, which sort of formed the way that I tried to write my prose, albeit unsuccessfully and definitely never as good as they could write. But I wanted to write from an era. I was inspired to write from an era that they wrote. And it's a funny story, because when I was about to publish this book, I was looking for a publisher. And I'll never forget, someone told me when I was making calls, I was getting very frustrated. Someone told me that, there's no appetite for West Indian literature anymore. You know, that was the appetite of the 70s and the 60s and a lesser extent the 80s, because of Windrush and because, you know, that's what publishers wanted. And of course, I don't have enough knowledge of that era in which I was not around. And I felt that that was really, really a huge statement, something that I still try to quantify up till today. But this was a very important person in local literature said that to me. But nevertheless, I powered on because, again, the work of Naipaul, the work of Salvon, it really even Haraladu as well. It really continues to have an impact today on the way we live, on our literary community, on the way literature is done. But more than that, what I've found in my own novel, An Unending Search, and you can move on to the other slide, Navin, thanks. What I found in my own novel is that, and this is the thing about really good books. Something like what Naipaul's writings, particularly Naipaul's writings, you know, the thing about good books is that it's applicable to every generation. You can sort of connect what is happening, and then you know, you sort of connect the whole migration. Let's just take a book from Naipaul, like I don't know, The Enigma of Arrival. Let's take another book. There's another one that I can't remember right now, but when you look at the migration crises that he so vividly painted in his books, you know, Naipaul really, you can connect it with the crises that we're all facing right now. We look at what's happening with Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago and that migration crisis. You look at what's happening in the United States, and you can sort of connect his writing. And I think that's you know, and in my own work, you know, there's this will for this young teenager to migrate, to get out of Trinidad, and he has this identity crisis of his own making because he's this young Indian boy trying to find his own place in the world, connecting two generations, a past generation that is quite, you know, very much distant and separate from the African community, that 1/3 that Professor Ramjan so clearly spoke about, and he's battling along the book. And I feel like, you know, that was really inspired in many ways by the stories and the writings of Naipaul, not just his local works, but the works in which he traveled to India and wrote about, the books that he traveled to Africa and wrote about. And he really, you know, you look at the work that Lonely Londoners from Sam Salvan, and, you know, they really connected this small chain of islands in the Caribbean to what was happening with the outside world. And Professor Ramjan wrote, you know, he spoke quite well about Sea Prasad Naipaul and the impact Sea Prasad Naipaul would have had. And Sea Prasad Naipaul, he explained how Sea Prasad Naipaul was almost what you would call today a news junkie. You know, he was very much into news. He understood the impact of news, and as such, he became a prolific writer, not only in writing books, but he had this appetite for news, which is so important when writing books as well. Let's move on to the other slide, Navin. And so my own piece of literature, it confronts the themes of racism and classism that Naipaul, you know, like I said, I'll keep repeating Naipaul because I was so inspired by him and his work. But also this sense of identity and belonging that Indian people, even a century after really getting here, over a century after getting here, they continued with this sense of identity, this sense of belonging for Trinidad and Tobago, whether this is really their place or whether the promised land of New York or London were their places. And so, you know, I really tried to touch on this will to find this better life since getting to Trinidad, and this will to always find something better that may not be here in the Caribbean, that may not be in Trinidad and Tobago. You could go on to the next slide. Yeah, and so I spent 16 years writing this novel. I started in 2009 and it was published, you can say 15 years because it was published in January 2025. And so, you know, it's what started off really as a means of really trying to tell a story in a similar way to how Naipaul told Miguel Street, and to tell it from a perspective of the late 1970s into the early 80s, particularly based in South Trinidad, where the Caroni 1975 sugar industry was at the centerpiece of life there. That really was the journey of writing this book. You know, I really wanted to highlight an era in Trinidad and Tobago where life centered around the sugarcane industry, but also for young people, they began seeing that they needed to find a way out of the sugar industry. You can move on, Navin. My hopes of the book is a couple of things, and I want to wrap up because I see 5 minutes left. But for adults who grew up in that era, I would like them to reminisce, you know, almost be nostalgic about what life was like. And it's always a compliment when they tell me that I've succeeded in doing that. But for teenagers, I want them to see what was life like for their parents, for their grandparents. You know, I think that's really important. But more than that, you know, there is this, how it connects with them, though the book is set in the late 70s, early 80s, how it connects with them is that even young people now have this sense of escapism. They want to go somewhere, whether it's because of the television stations they watch, whether it's MTV or BET or whatever television, Netflix or whatever stations they watch. There is this sense to leave, to escape Trinidad, to escape the Caribbean, to find this bigger, better, grander life that exists out of the Caribbean region. I think that's I think the book itself connects with those young people. This teenager, that is essentially the path that he's on, despite, you know, it being set in the late 70s, early 80s. And finally, you know, I see this as my contribution to West Indian literature, to Caribbean literature. You know, I grew up revering certain writers. I was made to revere certain writers as in the household that I grew up. And I look at their contribution, their immense contribution to West Indian literature that will live on well past my lifetime. And in many ways, I wanted to leave something as well, to show my appreciation for Caribbean literature. So I'll leave it at that, Shalima, because it does. I know that we are nearing 5 o'clock, and I know there are a few questions.
Thank you. But Ryan, let me just ask you, as Ellie Nyland expressed, her writing was to some extent therapeutic. To what extent was your writing this book therapeutic for you?
I wouldn't say, I would say honestly, Shalom, I'm sorry to answer you like this, but I would say it was more torturous. This has to be the absolute hardest thing I've ever done with my life. I don't think I've done anything harder than write a book. It was difficult. It was a huge journey. Really, I mean, you're taking this character on a journey, but you yourself are traveling on a journey as well. And you know, I think that it was really one of the most difficult things that I've ever done in my life. You know, what started off as a passion, and you know, I think it became very much an onerous task.
I can understand. Thank you. Dr. Mahabir.
Yes, thank you, Ryan, for gracing us with your presence, and all the other speakers as well. So do you plan to write another novel?
So, you know, I hear people saying all the time that, you know, I'm writing on this, so, you know, I'm going to write another novel, or I'm going to write a, you know, and it shocks me, because I think the best decision I made, not so much a decision, but the best thing I did in doing this book was that I kept it private for 15 years. Like I had never, nobody knew, not even my parents, nobody knew, not even my closest friends knew that I was writing a book. And I thought that was good, not because I have anything to hide, but I thought what was important is when you're writing a book, you don't want, this is my interpretation, my opinion. There are far greater experts than me who might differ. But I don't think you need the attention. You don't need the your friends asking you, hey, you know, how is the story developing? When are you going to finish the story? When might it be launched? You know, what's it about? I find those things incredibly distractive, and I don't need any added pressure that I'm already giving myself. So I think that if there is a second book, I think it will happen, but I think it will happen very privately, and at the time that it needs to be published publicly, I think it would.
Perfect. So what has been the response of your family to this book?
I think they were a little bit surprised. I come from a family of readers. I come from a family of writers. In fact, while I was listening to Professor Ramchan speak, I can't help but remember two things, two very coincidental things. My family always thought my sister would be the journalist, because she showed promise in journalism from a very early age. And we also thought that she would write the book, because I think that she was a much better writer than I was. And both never happened. In fact, I turned out to be the journalist and I turned out to be the author. My family has been incredibly proud, I think, of this achievement. But more so, I think and it's not just my family. I don't want to answer it in the context of only my family, but my community, my Princestown, where I grew up. I think there is this great appreciation about reading where these people come from. It's almost like, I don't want to say it, but I'll say it. It's almost like putting them on the map. It's almost like shining a light on a little dark place on earth that has never been seen or heard before. And I think they feel a sense of a little bit of pride that the book has been able, that, you know, how many, 200, 300 people have read it, that these people are reading about a place, that they live in, that nobody knows about, that nobody cares about.
Well, I think for some of us, I mean, both my parents, Shakira and I, both our parents came from Princestown. So both sides of our family are there, and we know the estate on which our indentured foreparents settled in Princestown and so on. It's extraordinarily important to us. So I'm very happy to hear that your book is about this place. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to ask Lavanya now. Lavanya, you've been waiting quite a while to ask your question. Please feel free. Go ahead. Can you unmute your mic, please? Lavanya?
Yes, she has to unmute.
Unmute again, please.
Dr. Tandavada, you're on mute right now, so you'll just have to unmute and then ask your question.
I did unmute. Thank
there
you
we
so
are. I think you're unmuted now, Dr. Tandavada.
Yeah, I unmute. You're hearing now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
lot of things, today I can say I got a lot of information from Guyana, the professor, about the culture and the changes, what's happening, so far. But I'm here for the past 20 years. Currently, I'm doing some research. Definitely, I'm doing some research on elderly people. Today is our Elderly Abuse Awareness Day. World. And this is our theme is like grow with conversation. We're doing that already. But thank you so much for the support. But I got a lot of information. But one thing I would like to know about the book readers and, who doing the writing the books, please share us. And we want to share to our secondary school students, because most of them reading books. No doubt, because example, my children, they read a lot of books. And Ryan did the book, I don't know either. So far today, I know that. Sorry to say that. It's not publicizing, I don't know. I didn't read that. Please reach out the secondary schools. I already mentioned intergenerational changes, and whoever in the Canada, we have some policies with the secondary schools to build up connections with the elderly. Please bring up that. I don't know about your opinion on this, please, through the Geriatric Society.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Ryan, can you please respond in particular to why your book has not been publicized as much as we think it ought to be?
So the honest answer really is that I'm a first-time author, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm a seasoned professional in this. And the truth is that I've learned as I've gone along. I've self-published. I don't have a publisher. I've been struggling. In reality, I mean, I hate to admit it, but I've been struggling to meet the demands of bookstores because printing books is very expensive. But what I've learned most importantly is that writing a book is one thing. You can have I mean, there are far more smarter people on this call who can correct me, but this is my experience. Writing a book is one thing. You can write a really good manuscript, but if you don't market that book, um, I don't know how far it will get. I think there are great books that have been written and have never been read by a large majority of people simply because it wasn't marketed in a major way. That's just my experience. And so I think we've tried in many ways, we've tried to, and I say we because, I have a very small team, that's really helping me every step of the way. We've tried to hit the audiences that are reader friendly, but in reality, our reading population has dwindled from when I used to read. I just don't, I just don't see that country, like, as a whole reading country anymore. So I think we hit pockets of people who, like, at the University of the West Indies, at Focus Literature Festival, at different literature festivals, at webinars like these. But we've had to be very strategic in the way that we market because, we didn't want to market to an audience that doesn't read or an audience that doesn't care for books, if you understand what I mean. And I think that's been the real challenge. Where do we put our effort and where do we put our money? Because self-publishing is very, very expensive. Trinidad and Tobago has produced, Professor Ramchan and company went through this incredible list from 100 years ago. For 100 years, we've been doing award-winning, and we don't have a publisher here. I was talking to a colleague yesterday in the writing fraternity who's using a Jamaican publisher. We don't have a publisher here. So, the book industry is a very challenging industry from unless you're an established writer, unless you have an agent, it's a really, really grueling industry. And honestly, Shalima, this Wednesday would mark 6 months since we launched an Unending Sage. And I'm very proud of what we've been able to accomplish without an agent, without a publisher. We've done social media, we've done television, we've done newspaper, we've done whatever. But I've just been so happy with what we've been able to accomplish without what everybody else has, what professional writers have. And that's how some of us have to live as authors. Not everybody is good enough to have a publisher. Not everybody is good enough to have an agent. Some of us have to, use our own salaries, etc., to print books and try to meet the demand. And sometimes, like Dr. Tandavada quite correctly said, sometimes we miss target groups in marketing, but not because we willingly do that, Shalima, but because our resources and our finances are limited. It's stretched to as far as it can reach. I hope that helps.
Of course. Everything you've said resonated with that statement that Jared Hussein raised, which is that the infrastructure is just not there.
Yeah.
So apart from the OCM Bocas Lit Fest, do we have anything else?
Yeah, that's a good question.
We don't.
It's the premier book. Bocas is the premier literature festival, and you know, to be honest with you, they do such an amazing job. But I would also venture to say that, and I don't want to underestimate fora like these, like this Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center. This is really important for Kevin making time to come. Professor Ramjan, I was shocked when he agreed to come because he's such an important name in local literature. You know, and this gives me a platform to also speak. So, you know, fora like these are also very important as well. But yes, Bocas remains the standard in the Caribbean.
Yeah. So thank you. So let's, Jenny Lind is in Mexico. Go ahead, please. You want to unmute your mic?
Yeah, just wanted to chime in because a point that Ryan made. I have self-published a number of travel memoirs, and when I was based in Toronto, and I tried to get into as many events as possible to promote my books. So, you know, I didn't have a team, but if as a self-published author, you have to work on the marketing almost full-time really, doing the marketing. But you said you published 6 months ago. That's a short time. Just keep at it and keep marketing and doing events like this online, and going to venues, just asking to do book readings at different locations, bookstores, libraries. That's what I did for a solid 3 years. And I was able to, you know, do some serious promotion on my travel memoirs. So just keep at it. That's what I had to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jenny.
You're welcome.
And let me just publicize here from Vinay Harichan, who is everything having to do with what is called the Cutlass magazine. He says he's not a publisher, but always happy to share and promote our community writers and their works. Always welcome agents and publicity teams to reach out. So we will connect you with Vinay. He's been an excellent resource, and certainly that's what we are here for, to build the networks. So I just want to ask you, please, share with us where your book is available and whether there's an e-version.
Yeah, so right now, Scribbles and Quills will have a few books. Paper-based would also have a few books. Nigel Arcan's unfortunately sold out, and we're working towards trying to replenish bookstores there. But Amazon, I think at this point, we are kind of motoring towards Amazon fully, where it's going to be a lot cheaper to have the books there instead of physically in bookstores. So it is available on Amazon right now.
Excellent. And I just want to shed a bit of a positive light on this. Professor Ramchan raised the Kohinoor Gazette, and I had the privilege of seeing the Hindi version of the Kohinoor Gazette only last week. And this is as a result of Dr. Jawahar Karnavat, who spoke at that conference at NCIC. He came in, he wanted to go to the archives specifically to find this particular publication. So let's look at how long after this particular document became important to India. He came here, he photocopied it, and he took it back to India, where it is going to be included in a particular publication that he is working on. So who knows where your book will take you?
True.
And how many years later? And to Ellie Nyland, to Jared Hussein as well, to all the other authors who are here, we really appreciate the work that you all do. This is significant to us who are readers, not necessarily writers, well, maybe as yet, but to somebody like Dr. Mahabir. Dr. Mahabir, please chime in, and Professor David Davidine. The work that you are doing and the work that the legacies that you all have left is significant. Dr. Mahabir, what would you like to say?
Yes, the typical person passes exam, gets a job, builds a house, buy a car, starts a family and all that. Typical. But to me, when you write, that's a legacy you leave behind. And yes, people call, from strange places, different countries, and they ask you for the book or something about your book. And I think it's a legacy to humanity when you put something down in writing and you have it in various libraries and so on. So that's a tremendous contribution to humanity.
Indeed. Is Dr. Davidine with us still? No, I'm not seeing him. He must have left, unfortunately. But I want to thank his sister, Ellie Nyland, so much for sharing. You really touched a chord with your writing. And it was not just for us in Trinidad, it was across the diaspora. Thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to bring today's program to a close. I want to say thank you again to Jared Hussein, to Professor Ken Ramchand, to Ellie Nyland, and to Ryan Bechu, whose idea it was to have this particular topic discussed. I want to thank you all very, very much for your time, for your expertise, and for doing the great work that you are doing. We are very, very happy to have been in your company today. Thank you so much. Over to you, Shakira.
Thank you, Shalama. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to attend and to participate. And as we said earlier, this public meeting is being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center. And like today, we often partner with the Amina Ghafoor Institute for the Study of Indentureship and its Legacies, led by Professor David Davidine. So our topic next Sunday will be part 2 of Was Indian Indentureship a Success? So we want to thank our planning team led by Dr. Kumar Mahabir and Shalama Mohammed. So please visit, like, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to see all our past recordings. I am Shakira Mohammed of Trinidad and Tobago saying goodbye. May God bless you all. Dhanyavad.
Thank you all. Thank you all for staying.